So for my next two projects, I'm kind of switching gears a little bit, and I won't be using any composites, which is kind of a nice break for me. I make stuff with a lot of plywood and cheaper lumbers, and it's nice to be able to, when someone orders something that uses specifically hardwoods. So I went to my local lumber yard, and it is 4/4 red oak and 4/4 African mahogany. So I'm going to be planing this stuff down because both of them need to be dimensioned to 3/4 of an inch. And you're going to see me planing the red oak, but the project for this red oak is something I've already filmed before in the past, so I won't be filming that project. But the African mahogany is going to be for a minimalist style mantle, so I will be filming that project. So I turned this on edge so that you could see it, and all these boards are rough sawn. But when you go to a good lumber yard and you get 4/4 material, which is an inch, it's actually going to be a little thicker than an inch. This is an inch and a 1/16. And the reason they do that is so that you can face plane both sides of it to get it to that inch thickness. You don't want to buy 4/4 material that's already an inch, and if you have to plane it, then it's less than an inch. So that's why they do that. So I'm going to be taking all, I think there's 5 pieces down to 3/4. So the design for this mantle is super simple. It's basically a sandwich, and one side's completely flat so it could go against the armature the customer already has put up above their fireplace. So the bigger boards I could basically rip to 9.5, 2 of them, and those will be pretty much done for dimensioning. And then this middle piece is 4 inches tall, but the way I'm going to attach all this together is with some mortise and tenons. So I'm actually going to make that piece 5 inches. And then on corners, everything will be joined with mitered bevels. So I could take this piece that I just planed, which is the smallest piece I have, and rip that down to 5 inches to make this inner section. And then the taller pieces, which are underneath the red oak, I could plane one side and then rip those down to 9.5. So whenever I buy solid lumber like this, like I'm assuming most people do, I buy more than I need, because especially if they're rough cut like these were, you can't really tell the condition of the wood underneath sometimes. So what I'm going to do before I rip all these down is I marked with about 2 extra inches the final length of my pieces, and I'm just going to cut this space off the end, and then obviously I could use that for something else, and it will make this a little more manageable to send down on my table saw. Now the skinnier piece, I'm not going to do that because the sides of it are going to be used for the sides of the mantle, so I'll probably end up needing all the length on that piece. So I cut my skinnier piece, which will be that inner framework, down to 5 inches, and that will leave me enough space to make about a 1/2 inch rabbet cut on either side, as well as on the bottom of this, which will create a long tenon on both sides of this piece. That long tenon I could then turn into multiple smaller tenons and then put receiving mortises on the top and the bottom of this mantle. So I went through and I made a mark You don't really need these marks because I'm going to be setting up my fence and using a dado stack to cut these, so they'll be identical. But I like to put marks on stuff just as a visual reference, and I'm making sure that my inside dimension will stay at that 4 inches so I have the height I want for my mantle. I put my 1/2 inch stack along with my sacrificial fence on there so I could cut these 4 rabbets by flipping and turning the piece to cut all 4 of them in 4 separate passes. So this wood is 3/4 of an inch thick, so I'm going to raise my blade right there to 3/16, which will give me about a 3/8 inch tenon down the middle of both sides of this piece. I cut that first rabbet, you could see, and it turned out great. So then I test cut the other side and then stopped to measure, because if this inside dimension is not 4 inches, you're going to have to make some adjustments. And it's actually just about perfect. It's a little over 4, which isn't bad at all. I'm going to keep it exactly like that. And you want to check, because just in case this one's the wrong size, you can make adjustments for the other 3 and turn this into the inside of the mantle. You won't see it if it's a little off, because if this isn't perfectly 4 inches, it's not going to fit over the frame that the customer already has in place on the wall. So now that I know that these are good, and my depths are good, and my widths are good, I could cut the other 3 rabbets. That is what those tenons on either side of this piece look like. And they go all the way down the side, and you could see how they come in the same amount and they're evenly spaced. So now that I have that done, I could start forming this inner part of the mantle. So those pieces are going to be joined with a miter. So the inner dimension has to be at least 84 inches, and since this wood is 3/4 of an inch thick, that means the outer dimension is going to be 85.5. So I measured the entire length of this piece, marked 85.5. When I had the excess, I divided that by 2 and then marked on either end how much excess that's going to be. And that worked out to 11.5 inches, which is perfect, because since this is 9.5 deep, and this doesn't go all the way to the front, I'll have plenty left over on either side to make that out of one piece. And then I could just trim it once I'm done. So with my mark on this side and the same mark on the other side, I can now put a 45 right here and right down there and start putting this together. I had to take my outfeed table off my table saw and twist it so that I can make this cut on the saw. You can use a handsaw for this, but the table saw is just going to be the most accurate, cleanest cut I could get. So that's what I'm going to do. So I've got this long piece of mahogany propped up so that that cut is a little easier to make. And I'm going to make that first cut and then measure again and make that second cut. Now usually these cuts aren't that bad, because it's just a matter of calculating the thickness of your material and setting up a fence on the table saw. Now I can't do that with this because this piece is just too long. So what I did was I marked where that 85.5 had to be and then drew a straight line. I took the piece I just cut off and used an angle on the top side to line that piece up. Once I had that square, I could go from the underside and mark where exactly that diagonal needs to be, and then I have a visual reference I can line up with my saw blade. Before I move my saw back into its original position, I'm going to be trimming my other boards down to size, because it's just easier to do it like this as well. You can see I have it propped up. So what I did was on each one I just straightened out the other edge, and that's because this is the scrap I cut off from the other end. You could see the texture that's left over from that radial arm saw, and there's even a little bit of tear out. And then this is the smooth cut from that cross-cutting saw in my blade with no tear out. It's just a much nicer cut. So with that done, now I marked that 86.5, and I'm using a pipe clamp attached to my miter gauge to help push this through the saw, and I could cut this one down to size as well. I propped this up on my radial arm saw table because it's the most level thing in here, and it's skinny enough that it will fit on there. Then I taped the corners together and taped up here just to make sure that my inside dimension will be 84 inches, which is what is needed. Because if that's not going to be long enough, there's no sense of gluing this together. So now that I have that together, I had this scrap piece of wood that I could cut into these little chunks with 45-degree bevels cut on either side. And I think on the inside of this, I'm going to use this for the glue up with some screws into it, because you'll never see the inside of this. And then once everything is set, I could take these out and just have the frame. So this side went together really well. There's no gaps in that miter, which is exactly what you want, because you're not going to be able to use putty on it, or even a glue filler on a piece like this. And brace for that temporary brace on the inside worked really well too. Now I used 1¼ inch screws, and these black marks, or I used the screw, I kind of held it on top like this to see where it would go into that wood to make sure it wouldn't go through the front. So those black marks are just telling me where to pre-drill my holes for these screws. Now you kind of jostle this around a little bit, gluing it together. So I'm actually going to let this side set up for probably an hour or so before I tackle the other side, just so I don't get it out of square and mess up the alignment when I'm gluing the other side. But the procedure on the other side is going to be exactly the same as this side. With this middle section dry, I can now start cutting my tenons into it. And I already did some test tenons over here. Now, there are various schools of thought about the width and thickness of tenons. Now these, I'm going to be splitting them down the line, basically because if you have one long tenon, it acts as one piece, and seasonal changes will affect this piece much more so than if you cut them into smaller sections. Now I've read a lot about the recommendations of what these are. For this, I'm going with 3 inches, and you could see the notches I drew over here with 1 inch in between the 3, and it worked out all the way down the line to fit perfectly. Now these tenons are not structural tenons in the sense of a table or a chair. They're mostly taking the place of screws or hardware, since you can't put any of that into a piece like this because you'll see it, and even if you've used dowels and filled dowel holes, you'll still be able to see it. So I'm basically kind of using these as screws going into each piece. Now you could butt join these and glue the top and bottom of these, and I think you'll be fine, but I just feel better with these tenons going into each piece and really sandwiching this together. So what I've done for this, and there's going to be excess back here, so I just trimmed off the excess. I've been taking a saw and just kind of cutting tiny little curves in between here and taking it out with a chisel. Now you don't want to mark up the front side of this at all because you'll see it in the final piece. So if you're not super adept with a saw or a chisel, just kind of cheat towards the back, or even start your chisel from the back, because if you pry up from the back or get saw marks in the back, you'll never see it because it will be hidden by the wall. So I'm basically just going to go down the line and cut all these notches, and I'm only going to be gluing one of these in at a time to make my life easier, trying to sandwich both of these together at once, especially since I don't know if you could see it, but there's a fairly nice bow in this front piece. Will just be pretty hard. That's something that I could stretch and move on one side, but trying to get it into two pieces is just going to be annoying. So I'm going to do one side, cut the receiving mortises, and then do the other side the same way. So there's a shot of all those cut tenons, and this might look super tedious, but that little segment I filmed where I think I cut 3 of these at a time took less than 2 minutes. So this was actually a pretty quick job for what it looks like. So now what I did was I picked the one side I'm going to be working off of, and I very faintly marked a 1/2 inch around 3 of the sides. And that's just because this pencil line might be seen at the end, and it'll be much easier to erase if it's a faint line versus something you draw in super thick. So I marked that this is the front, the bottom of this one, and now I can put that piece on here and start laying out where my mortises are going to go. So that 1/2 inch mark coincides with the front face of this mantle. So I wanted that lined up, and the bow in this board is going to make this a little difficult. So then what I did was I took my square and I set where those mortises are when this is lined up with that 1/2 inch, and it's about 5/8 of an inch. I went around all of my boards and checked and made sure that that measurement coincides all the way around. So now I can mark that on here as well as the thickness of these tenons and put a straight edge on here, and I'm going to start cutting out these mortises with a router. So after setting that one mark, I went through and set using my square where that second mark is, where that tenon starts, and those lines could be darker because they're going to be covered with the piece. After that, I realigned this back up and found where the back edge of that tenon is, and now I could go through and do the exact same thing for the back. So with those 2 lines showing me the distance and the placement of those tenons, I could realign this back up. And from the underside, mark where those teeth are going to start and end.